Good morning, great souls. We are continuing with our guidelines for conduct of members of the Ananda Sevaka order, the Ananda way of life. Let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, help us to feel your presence and your guiding wisdom within us. Show us the way to walk in your footsteps, that everything we do may draw us closer to attunement with God and Gurus. Om, peace. Amen. All right, we are still working on Article 8, which is work is service. So we have a little more to go here. It says, members who want to change their jobs should first consult the community or appointed representatives of the community, lest the change they propose cause inconvenience to any aspect of the community's life and activities, and also for reassurance from their spiritual family that the change will be for their own highest spiritual good. This is really just a repetition of what we've been talking all along, that we have to, if we're going to live in community, we have to participate in community, and we have to think not only what works for me, but what works for everyone. This sounds so simple when you say it, and before you're living in a community, it just seems like such a good idea. But when you're actually there, and we're actually accustomed to just doing what we want, when we want, because we want to, and then all of a sudden we're in this interactive relationship with everyone. At first, you can feel quite rebellious against it, but if you have, and see, this is the interesting thing. One thinks that the greatest strength required is just to go it alone and make things happen. A much greater strength that's required is to form relationships where you trust, really trusting relationships, and then actually allow people into your life, and then have to really explain yourself. It's mindless obedience is actually quite easy. If all the responsibility belongs to someone else, you just do what they say, it's their karma, it's not yours. But cooperative obedience, which is what Swami has required of us with Ananda, means that I have to actually explain myself. I can't just relinquish responsibility. I have to participate. And I may have to participate more than if I were just on my own. Because if I'm just on my own, nobody challenges me. I can say, this is what I think God wants me to do. And no one's going to say to you, are you sure? And when someone says, are you sure? You have to respond not with a panic, oh, no, 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 of course, anything you say. Or, yes, I am sure. You have to respond with a calm, undefensive balance of reason, feeling, and intuition, and be willing to have a discussion about it. Why do you think that? What are you feeling? What does that mean? What has it meant in the past? Have you considered? And then, if you still feel you're right, you have to have the courage to stand by your convictions. So it's much more subtle, infinitely more subtle, than either absolute obedience or complete independence. Likewise, members wanting to move from one Ananda community to another should first seek the order's approval, all for the same reasons. Members should feel that Ananda as a whole, and not the building in which they happen to live at Ananda, nor the area at which they work, is their own. This is a very important one as Ananda gets larger and larger. There's a natural tendency to know more Of course, it's inevitable that you will know more about whatever area of Ananda you are personally involved in. You will have responsibilities for certain things, and you may have an interest in others, but you may not have responsibility. But to be able to consider the welfare of the whole and not be biased in favor of my personal interests, this is all why community is such an enormous benefit spiritually, and can be much more of a challenge than you realize. Thus, should their service ever be required elsewhere, it will be easier for them to view the need as an opportunity for their spiritual growth and to accept it willingly with non-attachment. I lived my first 16 years at Ananda, at Ananda Village. Swami Kriyananda was in residence. I saw him almost every day when he was not traveling. Excuse me, I think I'm going to sneeze. Sorry about that. Okay, I think we're done. And I absolutely was convinced that I would never live anywhere that wasn't rural, because Ananda was a rural community, and I so loved living in the country that I just couldn't imagine living urban again. I'm going to sneeze some more. This happens to me. I know this is not very attractive on film, but here we are. Cinema verite. Okay. Anyway, I was committed that I would never live in an urban area again. I love living in the country. But the work that I do, that I've been called to do by God, is to help people get onto the spiritual path and help them get deeper in the spiritual path. So living at Ananda Village, I could serve the people who came there, but it's a long distance from most anywhere to get there. And so it just became necessary for me to go live where people were living, urban areas, where else? So Swami asked me to move to Palo Alto, which is where I've been since 1987 now. And it was a sacrifice. There's just no way around it. I really suffered from urban streets. I mean, this is suburban, this isn't even city. But just houses right next to each other, not knowing the people around you. I mean, there's so many strangers in an atmosphere like this, whereas at Ananda Village, everyone was known to me. And having to be in traffic and just endless numbers of things. But it's where God wanted me to be. And it was where I could serve him the best. And I would be dishonest if I said it was effortless. But in time I came to realize if I insisted on my own desires, as opposed to what the service God was asking of me, I wouldn't be happy anyway. So it was better just to accept what he asked. Now I don't even think about it. Now it seems perfectly natural to me because I'm way far away from that period of time. I mean, you can see there's a bit of nostalgia in me still about it, but it's like my childhood home. The way you have nostalgia for your childhood home, and then you grow up and you go out and do the life you were intended to live. So, but the more we think of it all as Ananda, not like this is the most important part, this is the most important part. No, this is the part where God happens to be putting me now. And if he puts me somewhere else, I'll be just as happy to serve there. It's all really the single question, what does God want? It's important to realize also, as Swami had to drum into my head, that merely because you don't want it is no sign that it's God's will either. Sometimes what I want and what he wants actually coincide. More often I have to come to understand, or I should say often though, I have to come to understand why he wants it from me. But that's the real question. What does God want? What do I want is not irrelevant, but it's not the only factor. That's how I would put it. All things being equal, if it happens to coincide with your inclinations, wow, isn't that great? Certainly, the work I do that brought me to live in this area matches my inclinations perfectly, because my primary inclination is to help people, and to help people by sharing these teachings. And that could be done best in this environment. So those were all big, big personal pluses that helped the whole thing balance out in the end. And in the principle of a monastic order, we go where we're needed. So Swami is emphasizing that, in fact, that's what this is. Now, and if you're not living in an Ananda community or in a monastic order, life itself makes certain demands on you, your family, your children, your own career, your work, your parents. It goes on and on. So where does God want me to serve? And that's not necessarily the same as what society, money, or your family wants of you. But they often do coincide. I've had people say, well, I just want to meditate and serve Ananda. Well, my dear, you're married and have 3 children. It's like, I mean, that sounds nice, but what's going to happen to your husband and those 3 children, or to your wife and those 3 children? This is the commitment that you've made. This is the commitment God has placed in your life, and it certainly has to be taken seriously. Such things cannot be just dismissed as Maya, because it's no accident that we end up where we end up. What is it that God is trying to teach me? When I face karma or responsibilities that I'm not fond of, which of course happens to us all the time, I try to say to myself, what is it that God is trying to teach me? Because the faster I learn it, the sooner I'll get through this karma. So one of the ways to deal with karma that's put in front of us is to try to understand why it's going to help me to become more spiritually free, and then move eagerly toward that freedom. And I was thinking just a little while ago, just randomly, when I was living at Ananda Village, there was a point where Swami suggested that we move to live next door to him, which of course really wanted to do, but in order to do it, we had to build a small house. And I realized in the effort to build that house that I liked being poor, because when I was poor and living very primitively, I was sure that I was spiritual. But if I lived in a small but comfortable home, would I still be spiritual if I wasn't poor? So my solution at first was to build an ugly house, because that would show how detached I was. But Swami said to me, you don't get out of karma by doing it badly. And that's been a really, really helpful principle. If you have to build a house well. Build a good house. Houses last long after their initial occupants. They serve people for generations. You can serve people for generations by building an appropriate, modest, simple, but nonetheless a good house. Well designed, well built, well thought out. Not something tacky and ugly that everybody else, whoever has to live in it, will wonder what you could have been thinking when you were making it. You don't get out of karma by doing it badly. I've had to think about that a lot of times. You have family karma, you have money karma, you have material possessions karma. You have to do it all well. That's how you get free from it, is when you conquer all aversion, all reluctance, all rebellion, and take it on, accept it, and take it on its own terms, and do it as well as you are able to do it. Now, I don't mean as self-indulgently, as extravagantly. To do it well also means to do it in harmony with the highest values. But you don't please God by showing him how non-attached you are by not participating in the responsibilities that he's given you. So, and the house, ended up being a very nice, modest house that I haven't seen or lived in for more than 30 years. And it served people very, very well. I was actually particularly touched. There was a young man who spent time at Ananda. He never became a full-time member, but he was a disciple, and he found great inspiration from Ananda, and he was diagnosed with cancer, which proved terminal. I'm not sure he was even 30. He might have even been in his early 20s. And he did many of the things he had wanted to do. I think he hiked one of the whole big, I can't remember which one it is, but the one that goes from Mexico to Canada. He hiked that whole trail even after he was diagnosed. And in the end, though, he wanted to leave his body at Ananda. And he came and he moved into the very house that I participated in building. And it was the scene for him and his family. That's where he died. And for some reason that just touched me so deeply, because I remember having built that house the first night that I spent in it, just thinking how many other people in the world and how many other adventures would happen under that same roof. As it turned, I lived in that house for 5 years, I think, and never since. Isn't that interesting? So we do things well. You raise your children well. You build your company well. You make your garden well. You don't get out of karma by doing it badly. So now, Article 9, money earned and received. Swamiji made the decision early on, consciously. He writes this in his book, Intentional Communities, How to Start Them and Why, that whereas many communities like to experiment with alternate economic forms, getting rid of money and just having work exchange and so on. One community in particular, I think it's called Twin Oaks, they've run on that basis. The Israeli kibbutz ran on that basis. There was no personal money, no personal possessions. Swamiji, the revolution Swamiji was interested in was the spiritual one. And he felt whatever sociological impact spiritual life would have, and the communities that he founded as Ananda were founded for the God realization of the members. And the community was there to support self-realization, and successful community was a byproduct. The first goal was God realization, but communities spring up harmoniously and naturally when all the people there are dedicated to God realization, and those communities can become wonderful examples and models for many people around the world. But the community is the collateral benefit, deliberate, because satsang is so helpful for God realization. But because of that, Swami did not feel that he was even at all interested, nor did he think it would be beneficial, to devote a lot of time to economic innovation or social organization innovation. In the kibbutz in Israel, for example, they experimented with children's houses, where the children from a very young age did not live with their parents, but lived in a children's house and were raised as a group, which freed the parents up to do more work. Now, of course, this came out of an absolute survival need, but it was also a social experiment. And the Twin Oaks experimented with just having work exchange. Everything was about labor credits, nothing was about money. Swami felt the traditional family structure and the economic system that we were used to would just be easier for us to just move into that. We wouldn't have to spend a lot of energy on what for us were peripheral issues. He also felt, I actually wasn't in this class so much as in another, very often historically, or too often historically, in monastic orders where individuals have no personal possessions and no personal resources, and there's no relationship between work and money in their own lives, which is to say, they don't learn how to use their energy to generate money. Often, if the monk or the nun loses their vocation, which means if the inspiration to follow the monastic life leaves them, but if it leaves them after they've been in the monastic order for some years, they have no personal resources and they may not have the personal confidence to step away from that lifestyle. So too often you end up with elderly monastics who have lost any interest really in being there, and they're being there because they don't feel they have any options in their lives. So I saw that as a great danger in monastic life, and one way to prevent it was to allow people to work for money, to have control over their own money, to generate money by their own energy if they chose to, and then have complete control over that. Plus, there are many other beneficial self-development reasons why money is a very helpful talent for people to develop. Swami writes about this much more in a Renunciate Order for a New Age and the book Sadhu Beware. Because money is a big part of life and can't just be dismissed. It's a barometer for a great many other things. So much so that Master said, the ability to earn money honestly and industriously to serve God's work is the next greatest art to realizing God. It's very interesting. So let's say Article 9, money earned and received. Members have a right to keep for themselves any income they earn or any money they receive from sources outside the community. That would be such as inheritances, for example. And because there are community structures, especially monastic, traditional monastic, where whatever money comes to you from your family goes to the community, not to you as an individual. Swami is very specific. No, that's not how Ananda is organized. He also wanted it to be that way because he wanted people to give because they were inwardly inspired to do so, not because they were compelled by the rule to do so. Everything about Ananda is not form, but consciousness. People might give all their money, but are they really generously and courageously handing that money over out of the joy of giving to the divine? Or are they doing it because it's a condition of living here? Now, what Swami has found and what we have found is when the giving is voluntary, people are very, very generous because there is a feeling of mutuality and a feeling of trust between the individual and the community. And so therefore there's a desire and there's a feeling of mutual generosity, not a feeling that the institution is more important than the individual. In fact, Swami described once the role of the spiritual director of Ananda is to intervene when the welfare of the institution is given a higher priority than the welfare of the individual. The job of the spiritual director is to protect the individual from the institution, which is an extremely interesting way to think about it. Protect because sometimes institutional needs just run away with themselves and people lose track of the fact that people are more important than anything, that the whole thing is the people. When people talk to me sometimes about Ananda, because where I live now, we have this beautiful church building that used to be a Catholic church. It's a wonderful structure, and I thank the Catholics every day when I go into it for having built it so beautifully so many decades ago. But it makes us, the only way I can put it, it makes us look like we're actually there. It makes us look like there's some independent reality that we would call Ananda Palo Alto, which is this building, and then we run an elementary school on that property and a high school on another property that we don't own. We rent where the high school is. We own where the lower school is. We put them all in one place, but the property's too small. Darn it. It's been an annoying thing. But because of that, we look like we are something, and people look at the thing and think that's the it. And I say repeatedly, and I say it as often as I can, Ananda is a group of sincere devotees seeking God. Period. And if it ceases to be that, or if it ceases to be the people who are seeking God, and if it ceases to be of enormous benefit to the people who are seeking God, the whole thing really actually ceases to exist, and it just becomes skeletons, because that's all it ever is. So don't make the mistake, if you're involved at all with Ananda, to think that it's a thing, or that you could be separated from it. As people say, you don't live at Ananda, you live in Ananda. And Ananda, of course, means divine bliss, but you live in the vibration and the spirit of what Swami has created. And satsang is part of it. We exemplify it in its most developed form, its residential community and temples that we have in a few places. But it's because there's magnetism to manifest that form. It's not the form that creates the magnetism. Satsang and satsang, residential satsang, worship together satsang, meditate together satsang, is a powerful definition of Ananda. We are in this together. Master called it self-realization. When he came to America, he called it self-realization fellowship, which is not just a convenient use of English words. It's self-realization is between the devotee and God, but fellowship means that we can work together for our individual self-realization. Without that word fellowship, it was just self-realization, the Institute of Self-Realization, or whatever you would want to say, or just self-realization, then we would all be on our own. But Master himself added that word, fellowship. In India, he uses the word satsanga, which means fellowship with truth, but also means fellowship with truth seekers. And not an egoic fellowshipping, as I've often heard some Christian pastors speak of it. I love making it into that word, fellowshipping, which means sort of hanging around with each other. But inner attunement, that's what we're really looking for. And you see, what holds Ananda together is very interesting. We have wonderful relationships with each other. But what gives the joyous intensity to our relationships with each other is that we're all trying to be in tune with the same higher reality. A friend of mine who came to Ananda through the Palo Alto church here, she's a very extroverted person by nature, and she was a successful businesswoman, and she was just very good at, and still is, extremely good in a wonderful way of interacting with people. She loves people. She loves to interact. And she had come from another sort of more of a New Age tradition. And when she first came, she just sort of tried to make friends, tried to be with people in the way she was accustomed to being with them, which was, because of her nature, was very loving and on a high level. But it was really based on personality affinity. And the way she described it to me later, and all of this was just very interesting to me, because there's no rule book that says anything about how this has to work. The way she said it to me, she said she felt like she was made out of Teflon. She could not make contact with anyone. She just couldn't make any connections. And finally she just decided, looking at the big altar in the church, she just said, oh, I'm just going to forget about all the people in the seats. I'm just going to concentrate on making friends with the people on the altar, meaning the pictures of the masters. And she said, almost as soon as she decided to focus on the masters, all of a sudden she found that she was making friends with the people around her too. I was fascinated by that, but not surprised. I just never thought of it that way. We all get in tune with the masters, and then we find ourselves being in tune with each other, even if our personalities don't match at all. It's just we can be very eccentrically different from each other. But what unifies us is our aspiration for God. God bless you.